I would request everyone to please settle down. I request everyone to please settle down. We are starting with our last session. The session is titled Cooling Conundrums, Navigating Challenges in Adopting Non-Traditional Cooling Technologies. As part of this session, we will explore the forefront of sustainable innovation in cooling through non-in-kind technologies. The session will investigate technological advancements, address adoption barriers, evaluate environmental impact, discuss regulatory frameworks, bring forth industry insights, and highlight the need to foster collaboration. The session aims to provide attendees with a comprehensive understanding of NIK options, identify actionable strategies for accelerated adoption, inform policymakers, and lay the groundwork for collaborative efforts shaping a greener future in cooling solutions. The session's flow is of a fireside chat to be held in a press conference style. The audience is welcome to participate. We are privileged to welcome distinguished experts representing the industry. I would request the experts to please come forward on the stage as I announce your names. Mr. Ravi Chandran Purushottaman, President Danfoss India. Mr. Ravi has been handling several roles since 2002 in Danfoss across several markets in Asia Pacific, including South Asia, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Germany. His areas of work cover climate change, energy efficiency, decarbonization, and food loss. Next, I would like to welcome Mr. Sudhir Parla, Managing Director at Tabreed Asia. Mr. Sudhir spearheads the joint venture between Tabreed and IFC, driving the company's foray into India and the broader Southeast Asia region. His primary focus revolves around market creation, innovation, and business localization to scale cooling as a service and district cooling adoption in these dynamic regions. Our moderator for the session is Dr. Satish Kumar, President and Executive Director at AEEE. Prior to AEEE, he was the Energy Efficiency Ambassador and led the energy management business at the Schneider Electric India, a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and the Chief of Party for USAID-supported bilateral Energy Efficiency Technical Assistance Program, ECO3 project. Welcome to session, everyone.
Thanks, Stuti. Welcome, Ravi. Welcome, Sudhir, to the panel. First of all, my thanks to both of you for being a supporter of AEEE and also for being a sponsor of this feed event. What makes AEEE unique is our triple sector approach, where private sector plays a very, very important role. And we are going to have, I think, some question and answer and some interactions here, and we are going to have some fun. So are we ready for that? Okay, all right. So I think we are coming almost to the end of the conference, and cooling as a topic, I think if all three of us, we are probably, it's dear to our hearts. And I will start with one statistic here. We are living in India, and if you think about, we talk about our 1.4 billion population and our tropical climate, and what actually captures this in one statistic is that India has 4 trillion person cooling degree days, and that is 1.4 billion people, and then if you multiply that with 2200 cooling degree days as a national average, then we get to like 4 trillion person cooling degree days. And I think with that kind of the cooling demand, the inherent cooling demand, this is about 12 to 13 times what I think what's the cooling demand in the US, and about 3 to 4 times the cooling demand that's in China, just to put things in perspective. And I think India really has to think differently. We have to think outside the box to think what are the different ways, what are the different kind of technology, what are the design techniques, how are we going to use our traditional knowledge in terms of designing sustainable buildings, what are the not-in-kind technologies that is going to make this happen. So my first question, I think to both you, Ravi and Sudhir, is that I think from your vantage point where you are sitting and the magnitude of the challenge that we are staring at, what do you think needs to be done to address this change? And I would give you the sort of liberty to be as provocative and as aspirational as possible, because we know that this is a very hard to solve problem, and I think doing just the routine things or business as usual things is not going to get us to the goal, I think, that we are all trying to get at. So over to you, Ravi, first.
Thank you, Satish, and happy to be back in feed. Let me just pick this up from where you left. So what problem are we trying to solve? I know cooling is one of the elements that we are talking about here, but I think the bigger challenge that we have in front of us is, when you look at where India is sitting right now, we want to become a $5 trillion economy and then a $10 trillion economy. What are the implications of this on the energy envelope of this country? When I look at the level of penetration cooling has today, air conditioning has a penetration of about 10 to 12%, refrigeration has a penetration of about 6 to 8%, and we are seeing the middle class of India growing much more in terms of economic prosperity. The per capita income is shifting towards more and more consumption of, comforts, especially cooling is one of them. Nutritious products directly implicating on the refrigeration demand. So we are seeing an increasing penetration of cooling products. We are also seeing a gap between the demand and supply in terms of space cooling when it comes to summer. If you map the top 10 cities of India, you find almost there's a 20% swing coming from cooling in the summer months of every city. Whichever city you map, I think probably you'll see that the swing is between 20% to about 15% or 18% in that level actually. So whatever we want to do in the future from a cooling perspective, we must build a strategy to decouple energy demand or energy intensity to the way we want to grow our economy. So we have to decouple GDP growth and energy growth. And when I look at, from what you said, that India wants to have a 15x growth in cooling and India wants to have a lot more refrigerated products, the only option for us is to look at not incremental thinking but more disruptive thinking. Now in my world where I'm sitting, you need to simplify the problem. Many of us are not really able to simplify the problem. We believe an ECBC code will solve the problem. I don't think so. Because ECBC code is meant for somebody who's putting up a building. The one who's occupying the building does not know what an ECBC code is, right? How do you simplify the problem where a consumer participates in the transformation of cooling? This is the biggest challenge we have. Finally, who pays for the energy bill? It's the consumer actually. So how do you build a business model transformation that makes the end user who consumes energy is finally going to see the benefit of energy efficiency or decarbonization? So this is the fundamental problem we need to solve, in making sure that we can holistically decouple the GDP growth and, the energy intensity actually. So that's my first, corollary that I want to leave with you all. The second, I think, we are not a country where we have a lot of R&D investments going on actually. So we need to look at how do we embrace technology quickly. you know. If you look at China and learnings from China, China has scaled up on some of those technologies in a massive manner, and they've really disrupted the cost of the technologies as well. So deploying technologies is a very important piece in cooling as well. Like, for example, if you take space cooling, I think it's common sense, everybody knows that district cooling offers lots of advantages. You know, the funny side of cooling is, since it's a fireside chat, you said, you know, it's a triple dirty business. One, you take coal energy, right? You switch on an air conditioner, which is a vapor compression, which is made from a chemical compound, and then you throw the hot air as a heat island into the outside air actually. So it's 3 times dirty, right? So how do you make this more sustainable? You can only do this by disrupting the technologies. And what is the option for you? District energy is a fantastic option for us. But why have we not embraced district energy? I mean, there have been so many reports published, and even you printed out the guidelines for district cooling. I cannot find where district coolings are installed today, but guidelines are there that we have. So I think we are thinking a lot ahead about what it should be looking like, rather than dirtying our hands on some things and scaling up that actually. And this is what China has done very, very smartly. So deploying technology requires a mindset change. It requires business model transformation. It also requires not wait for policy, but you know, some private sector, private sector has to take the lead here in my view. And there are fundamental opportunities for us to use district cooling. I mean, I remember before Sudhir arrived on the platform 7-8 years ago, when we did the base case for district cooling, 10,000 tons of district cooling had an IRR of about 14-15% at that point in time. But today, when you sit and look around where the world is sitting, the IRRs are looking much prettier. But I simply don't understand why even at 25% IRR, nobody wants to invest in district cooling, right? Take the example of the new Parliament House that was built, right? The Parliament House is 20,000 tons of air conditioning, right? We could have put a district cooling instead of 6 chillers of whatever kilowatt actually. So I think we all know the problem, but you know, we don't really want to go in for something that is disruptive in thinking. You know, so I would call the mindset challenge is the biggest challenge that we have in terms of disrupting some of these ideas. I think I'll come back again after maybe Sudhir shares his thoughts, but I have a lot more eccentric ideas on how we can look at the industry. Yeah.
But before I go to Sudhir, I have one question. I said that we are going to make it a little bit of fun and provocative. And since we don't have any government personnel and this thing on the dais, so who is the primary culprit that you feel can actually bring about this, or who is the chief instigator who should be bringing about this mindset change that you are referring to?
I think it's the entire educating the entire civil society. The whole ecosystem is to be blamed here, because we have not understood the impact of climate change and what this cooling demand is going to cost to us in the future, right? So I think everybody is to be blamed. The consumer of cooling, you know, the producers of cooling machines, the whole, you know, ecosystem is to be blamed here in my view. I don't think you can pick any one here actually.
Okay, thank you. So I will, I think I'll go to Sudhir. Sudhir, Tabreed has been a pioneer. I think you have been pushing the district cooling agenda. I think AEEE is trying to also push it along with you. And I think it's tough going. I wouldn't say that we have made a lot of progress. I think as Ravi mentioned, that there is a lot of capacity building, a lot of awareness creation that has to be done. So how do you see, I think, India as a market? How do you respond to sort of like Ravi's this thing that we all are kind of failing in our responsibilities? And I think if we really want to see transformative action on the ground in terms of what's happening in China, or maybe I think you can narrate some experiences from Middle East, what needs to change? What I think in your opinion are sort of like the primary things that need to be done?
Maybe Satish, before I answer that question, I'll just try nuance some of the points that Ravi made and you said a little bit more, kind of bring it back to the topic a little bit, and then maybe through that, if an answer comes out, awesome. If nothing comes out, sorry about that, right? So I mean, I think start with when you're saying non-traditional cooling technologies or not-in-kind technologies. So just kind of starting with that itself. I mean, it's basically, I mean, if you just go to the definition, it's essentially technologies that don't use vapor compression, right? So from that standpoint, district cooling is not technically a not-in-kind technology. It was defined as one in the Indian Air Cooling Action Plan, but I would say that, I mean, probably it was mixed up between district cooling, tri-generation, district energy, to call it as not-in-kind. But if you look at district cooling itself, it's not exactly a not-in-kind technology, right? And I think so, within the context of that, and we're saying that what we're trying to do here is kind of navigate challenges in adopting non-traditional cooling technologies, which include district cooling models. If you see why, right? I mean, why is it that we need to be doing this to start with, right? Essentially, I mean, like Ravi said, and the thing is, vapor compression is the dominant way right now. It's 100 or 200 billion, probably even global industry at this point of time. And you look at essentially what are the 2 or 3 key things that possibly could be solved from looking at not-in-kind technologies. I would probably say, or even what the challenges are. And I'll just probably talk through the challenges and the solutions and or what can be done, and maybe we can come with something, right? So the first is I would say, the refrigerant problem, right? The second, I would say, is the efficiency problem and solution as well, both vice versa. And the third would be also extending the conversation beyond just cooling. It's also the peak energy demand problem, right? So efficiency, of course, is consumption, and peak energy demand problem. So if you look at these 3 as the things that need to be looked at within the context of the numbers you gave of India's extremely high current as well as rapidly growing cooling demand, if you take each one by one, and I think vapor compression, of course, is if you look at the refrigerant issue primarily to start with, the dominant technology uses vapor compression, like I just said, and there, if you look at the big issue is basically more around refrigerant leaks and what that does to the environment in some ways, because just in the and this has been a problem that's been there for a long, long time. It's not anything new. We first started with talking about chlorofluorocarbon CFCs in the 50s and the 60s, I think, where basically when people started realizing that CFCs have an extremely high ozone depleting potential, the move was to kind of ban them completely and move towards HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, right? And to avoid the issue it has on the ODP, on the ozone depleting potential to begin with. Moving on to HFCs, while the ozone problem was kind of partly solved, the issue was there's a lot of global warming potential from these, and as a result of which, then the Kigali Amendment of the Montreal Protocol started looking at how to phase out HFCs and move towards HFOs. HFOs, even now, if you see the most recent research and science that's coming out, is talking about how HFOs itself can also actually have an inadvertent ozone issue as well. So now again, there's a lot of push, especially in Europe and so on, to again look at even banning HFOs also coming to the market. So basically, science in some ways, I think the way I look at science is basically progress from one graveyard to the next, essentially. What is a solution right now may not be a solution tomorrow. And across the spectrum, if you look at just the vapor compression cycle itself and what is currently being mostly done, the challenge here is basically around, I would say, largely refrigerant leaks and what it does to the planet, right? I mean, I think latest estimates right now, basis the current mix and basis what commitments countries have made, if you look at the next 30 years, the CO2 equivalent from refrigerant leaks is basically almost 57 gigatons of CO2 emissions in the next 30 years. So it's huge, and nobody talks about this. Of course, the whole focus on decarbonization. But you look at the impact that refrigerants have on the overall climate scenario, it's massive, right? So even before going into non-traditional cooling technologies, even within the traditional cooling technologies, there is no focus right now on how and what do we do to prevent these leaks. As simple as in most of the conversations that we have in India at this point of time, in the grade A, LEED Platinum, LEED Gold certified buildings, when we propose that as a company, for example, we have a zero refrigerant leak policy, we want to make sure that every plant of ours has either a refrigerant recovery unit or a leak detection system. The first point is why? It's going to cost money, we don't want you to do it. Because we are kind of too used to externalizing all the climate costs and only paying for what we have to pay. So while we can say that a big part of the climate problem is because of what happened in the West, in some ways, at this point of time, even something within the traditional cooling technology space itself, there is no focus on just simply managing the issue of leaks using vapor compression and the traditional cooling cycle. Now go into alternatives, which is basically, I mean, if you look at the most accessible ones right now, forgetting all the over-the-horizon technologies and so on and so forth, including solid state technologies. Ammonia, propane, CO2, and so on and so forth. Ammonia, of course, I mean, propane is combustible, ammonia is toxic, CO2 has high density, and all of these can only work in certain applications. They won't necessarily work within a commercial building or a space cooling construct. And there, the big challenge is because is regulation. And regulation is the way it is right now for the right reasons, right? Basically, you could kind of solve the climate impact from refrigerant leaks by moving towards these alternatives that are very easily available right now, and actually with very minimal changes to HVAC systems, you can actually start adopting them a lot more. But the reason why you can't do that is primarily because of the issues in handling them and the regulatory barriers. And like I said, the regulatory challenges are valid, and you need to have more sophisticated operations and ideally move them away from site to potentially a district cooling plant, to then have somebody who can then manage this, operate this, and do this in a more professional way. Until that happens, of course, it's a huge challenge to continue to move away from that, right? So again, before going to non-traditional, I'm just talking within the traditional space itself, you have the inability to kind of start addressing the climate issue from a refrigerant standpoint, either through moving towards ones that have low GWP and low ODP because of regulatory challenges and issues around hazard and so on, coupled with lack of market models that can enable moving towards centralized systems and district cooling systems that can just solve this 57 gigatons of CO2 over the next 30 years. Forget anything else and forget all other alternate technologies and so on and so forth, right? Now move to the next one in terms of efficiency. And again, looking at that in the context of non-traditional cooling technologies, I would actually look at this as two parts of a problem. One part is, again, if you look at what our cooling systems do, it's both manage temperature as well as humidity. You start splitting that, right, essentially between having systems that can look at both just the sensible and the latent load separately. On the sensible side, which is essentially to reduce the temperature, there are a lot of technologies that can, readily be deployed, which is essentially heat to heat, not necessarily going from heat to electricity to heat, whether it's heat pumps, geothermal systems, waste heat recovery, and even gas and so on and so forth. And segregating them between, and even on the humidity side, there are solutions that are already being applied right now, which can, just by decoupling these two, right, and not having one chiller, one system do the job of both, you can already start working towards 30 to 40% efficiency improvements already, right? And there are solutions out there which are applied in a very narrow context, only because, again, a big part is the mindset point that Ravi mentioned, where basically, because nobody applies a systems thinking approach or a life cycle approach to looking at things, you don't see people thinking about this on those lines. And of course, I think, there is there is probably room for technology improvements as well. I wouldn't think that there are enough solutions as alternatives out there to vapor compression. And then finally, the last one beyond this, if you look at the peak demand that is coming about because of this and the pressure that cooling is putting on the energy systems as a whole, right? Storage. Here again, at a building level, the options are very, very minimal. You can, things like ice and so on and so forth don't necessarily make sense. The most viable, widely acceptable commercial model is using water as a means of storage to shift peak demand to evening times, to then shave as much as 20% of the peak energy demand. There again, for having water-based storage solutions, basically using water as a medium, you again need to have a critical mass or a size, which is thermal storage tanks within district cooling context. So I think, it's basically all kind of point towards there are a combination of interventions within the traditional solution space along with non-traditional space, which can more effectively be deployed when there is an enabling environment for load aggregation in a district cooling system with more sophisticated way in terms of how you design, build, operate, and provide systems. And here, what has worked in other parts of the world is basically people recognizing this and looking at it from a life cycle standpoint, and then essentially letting the private sector take the lead to implement solutions. And that's what is missing right now out here. Sorry, it was a long...
So thanks, Sudhir. I think three things that you mentioned, I think most of these, I would say, can be classified more around the technology, and I think how, so the refrigerant angle, that is also very, very important, because I think the entire Earth is undergoing through several cycles of, I think, the refrigerant substitutions, as you also mentioned. Also, I think the point that you made about splitting the sensible and latent loads, I think that's also a tried and trusted way to actually reduce this thing. And then the peak demand and storage, where again, I think district cooling systems can actually provide a lot of advantages there. So I think that's good. What I would like to come back, I think, and again, I'll start perhaps with Ravi. You said that you have a couple of more points to add. So while we are talking about technology, we know that I think if we are looking at non-traditional cooling technology, I think in the, how do you see the role of policy, and how do you see the role of human behavior affecting the cooling demand? And where do you think, I mean, we have done enough? Or if you are sort of thrust upon the role that, okay, how am I going to actually set the next generation of policies that is going to harness the advantages that the private sector brings to the table in terms of, I think, the technology, the innovation, the business model? How would you sort of like structure some of the policies that would take advantage of all these technologies and all these great businesses that I think we have access to right now in India?
So, you know, it's a very difficult challenge that we expect a lot from policy making. But I think in real world, policies have its own limitations. I think even after 25 years, we are still trying to improve the ease of doing business as one example, actually. The reason for that is external changes are very rapid, right? So, and then once you have made an improvement in the policy, the external changes makes your policy as a paralysis, right? It brings back policy to policy paralysis, actually. So, I personally believe any policy should create a pull effect on the consumer, right? So, if you take the LED example, we were very successful because everybody understood what benefits it can give to your pocket. So, cooling has to be demystified to make people understand there is an underlying potential of money in the form of energy efficiency. I think the biggest challenge that I see, even after labeling programs, how many of us really buy a 5-star labeled air conditioner when we go into the market? We are driven by what is marketed rather than what is labeled, right? There is a policy here for 5-star, but do we really buy a 5-star actually? So I think it should be more transformed into what is in it for the consumer and how can he see that benefit while buying something, you know. So there is a little bit of gap between policy and the intended benefits coming out of the policy. So we need to really close that loop when you make policies. The next thing in my view is, I think today with digital and the evolution of digital technologies, an air conditioner, a washing machine and any kind of equipment tomorrow going to be moving from a capex to an opex model, right? We are not very far away from a Netflix moment of how this is getting used in the future. And this is good for energy efficiency because everything is getting digitized. The trust level between the consumer of energy, consumer of cooling, and the supplier of energy is getting more and more transparent actually. The other thing, as we were just before here we were talking about, I think in the stock market today you have a lot of companies which is aggregating physical assets like REITs, and you're listing them on the stock exchange. So if REITs are looking at wanting to make a better balance sheet, better financial model, they really need to look at how to make policies help REITs make more money. And under-harvested energy efficiency can be really tapped into. There's a lot more money sitting on energy efficiency in many of the buildings today. You know, we just surveyed last year about 180 odd buildings which over a period of 3-4 years who have gone in for the best of technologies. 30% of the buildings were well manned. There was absolute data-driven decision making on 30% of the buildings. 70% of the buildings that had the best-in-class technologies the building automation systems. They simply didn't have the right skills in the organization to really take action on data, right? So we have an intent to build a green building, right? But you also need social transformation on making a green building really green, right? Because when you move into your building, you only occupy 20%, 30%, 50%. You design a building for 100% actually. So there is this gap between the intent, right, and the usage. And that's a lot of money left on the taking actually. And that's what I call as the potential under-harvested energy efficiency in a building. But today there are technologies, for example, if you take some of the oil-free technologies like Turboco, which we supply even to a data center, you know, if it's 20% load, it still gives you the maximum efficiency. If it is 100% load, it still gives you the maximum efficiency. But this is less understood while you make the decision making of the site or the project, right? So I think policy can only give you some amount of penetration, but policy with end user benefit impact can actually make the policy even more powerful. That's
Policy, I think
it should be the role of policies. I'll give you a dichotomy. For example, we have ECBCs. How many states have implemented ECBCs?
That's an implementation challenge.
That is, one is the implementation challenge. Second is how to understand ECBC at a state level, right? Because each and every state understands a sentence in a different way, right? We are a country of 30 different continents, or a continent of 30 different countries.
Are you saying that it is too technical, or it is written in Chinese?
No, it is about how does see, there are multiple stakeholders who use ECBC, right? How does it finally translates into benefits for all the stakeholders? That has to be articulated in the policy. Why do they do what they need to do?
So maybe like maybe a explainer or a user guide, which is sort of like
You need a playbook.
demystifying.
You need a playbook. The policies have to be a playbook for everybody to use it, like a manual when you buy an air conditioner, or a manual when you buy a refrigerator, right? The other thing is, you know, ECBC is one example I'll give you. Like, for example, you have a hospital. A hospital, when it starts up, it builds 500 beds. 2 years later, they expand to another 500 beds, right? Now, ideally speaking, if that 500 beds have never met their ECBC norms, you should never give license for another 500 beds, right? Because what you're doing is, in the city, your cooling demand is shooting actually. So we also need to see the carrot and stick method of how do you deploy this in a very sustainable manner. Otherwise, what happens? The challenge really is for the bottom of the pyramid for us, because they are the ones who are going to face the challenge on the cost.
So, Ravi, I'm going to put you on a spot a little bit. I think Madhur and I were just talking about and laughing at this problem, that every five-star hotel, they are not at the bottom of the pyramid. And I think their control systems is totally screwed up. I mean, you freeze to death. And we know that Danfoss has so many, I think, parts and solutions to solve this problem. So why is, I think, that problem not getting solved? Is it an awareness problem? What is it?
I think it's awareness, it's skills, it's also how we design, right? Design principles, because we don't use user-driven design principles, right? We historically use design principles that have been repeated again and again and again.
Cookie cutter, yes.
So I think we need to look at, I don't know if this is still an LED or a CFL or whatever it is, because I cannot see. Yeah. And it's probably consuming a lot more energy, right? So anyway, I'm not luckily in the bulb business, but there's a huge potential sitting there. But this is true. You walk into any hotels today, even one of the best-in-class five-star hotels, there's a lot of opportunity for energy efficiency. So I would say skills is one issue, awareness is another issue, and I also think there's a lot of talk about energy efficiency in the boardroom, right? But I think if you don't really bring out digitally something out of the building, you don't really see the gaps in the building, right? So today you have BIM and digital twins, and we need to still demystify them on how we can deploy them through digital technology, so that this bulb throws up right away into the CFO table, that there's a dashboard in my hotel and I can see we are losing money here, right?
So you are saying that the the dashboards and the visuals have been developed, which is sort of like exciting as far as digitalization. But going deeper down into
It's
where
very
the
important.
problem is,
It's very
I think
important.
that is not happening.
See, I'll tell you another example. When we built our campus 50,000 square meters, my water consumption was 150, 60 kiloliters. But once I digitized all my water points, the consumption points as well as the demand points, I got it down to about 50 kiloliters, right? Once I started measuring my food waste, yeah, which was 110 grams per person, today it is 54 grams per person actually. You need to measure everything to take action actually. And you need to support that with the right awareness, understanding the dashboard, execute that actually. But I think this cannot come from fully from policy, right? Policy should be more driving what is causing the damage to the ecosystem, right? But what actually is your contribution to that ecosystem has to be controlled by enterprises.
No, well said, Ravi. So same thing, I think to you, Sudhir, that I think what do you, I think from your vantage point, do you see the role of policy? And I think what are your ideas in terms of what policy? I think I like this push versus pull. I think the analogy has been there for the ages, that I think through the policy, I don't know whether we are pushing, but I think and I think then the customer demand is going to actually create the pull that will sell the more product. And also, I think we discussed a little bit about the role of digitalization. You touched upon it. So I think what are your thoughts on some of these topics?
I think in some ways there is also a bit of policy overload at this point, right? I mean, in general in the country. And so I would say actually, of course, execution issues is a big issue, like Ravi highlighted for EasyBC and so on. But more than policy itself, I think part of the thing which at least from the last 5-6 years of interacting more and more with various governments in the country is kind of becoming quite clear is, in some ways I feel that the institutional setup that we have right now was designed for a different period in time. And right now, the kind of problems we're trying to look at and the things we're looking at is a lot more cross-cutting and holistic. You have a Ministry of Renewable Energy that looks at their own policy guidelines. You have Ministry of Power that looks at something else, MOHUA that looks at something else, Ministry of Climate that looks at something else, Ministry of Commerce something else. So between this siloed approach towards policy with extremely rigid positions, and that again you have at the city, state and the central level, the federal structure that we have, that's it. That's where all luckily there's no government here, but exactly that's where all the dance and everything is happening. And we already are seeing more and more need for interministerial cooperation and stakeholder meetings, which you know very well how hard that is to do that, right? So the more that can actually dissolve to look at things more holistically, I feel solutions and policy will automatically arise towards, because ultimately we're looking at very common problems and very common things to go in a certain way. But because of these very rigid positions and approaches that we have and guidelines and rules and thinking, we're kind of getting stuck in the loop of either over policy or no policy. And then of course the execution becomes an issue. So that's all, I think needs to change, and I don't know how that's going to happen. It almost should be like a company where you have a corporate scorecard and the departmental scorecard should be subordinated to that, and yeah, a complete rethinking. I know that we can't do that by ourselves out here, but if Mr. Modi ji can do something about that, that would be amazing.
You're hitting a very big point, because see, institutional repositioning of Bureau of Energy Efficiency, the time is now. In my view, I'm not getting political here, but I'm just telling you the facts that what you elaborated, institutionally repositioning Bureau of Energy Efficiency under the Prime Minister's office makes a lot more meaning than, say, putting it under the Power Ministry, because, energy is as good as food today, right, from a common man's perspective. And it also has holistically to collaborate with several other ministries actually. And there are some very good examples in some countries where they have tried to reposition energy efficiency under the Prime Minister's office. It gets a very high attention, right? Energy security is as good as today, very important security element for the entire 1.4 billion people actually. So we also need to look at, in the new world where India wants to move, does it make sense to institutionally reposition BE differently? Just a food for thought.
Just on that, and also I think since we are discussing policy and ease of doing business and this thing, Danfoss is a multinational company, Tabreed as well. And you have sort of like worked in various geographies. So I think if from your sort of like experience, Sudhir, I'll go to you first, that can you give us some examples where I think India can learn? I think, of course, there are areas where India is leading as well, but where India can learn and where you are saying that policy paralysis or overload, I think what is the prescription here? And I think it's always better to have some examples where we can say that, look, I think this is how it worked. So I think any ideas on that front, I think it would be really, really helpful.
Sure, Satish. I can just talk within the context of cooling, district cooling, and policy action on that part within the GCC context that has happened, right? I think, so of course, district cooling as a sector wasn't regulated even in the Middle East up until very recently. It was completely market-driven, market-led, and it was mostly B2B within, and it grew in a certain way and form in the first 10 years of its journey, whether you look at Abu Dhabi, Dubai, or the remaining GCC countries and so on. Singapore, of course, is slightly different. So what happened, and our role as well in trying to support policy action was essentially, after it got to a certain point when we saw that, that across the board, look at any stakeholder, none of the stakeholders were necessarily happy with the way the market had grown. And something had to be done to at least ensure that all stakeholder interests vis-a-vis what they have in mind needs to be taken care of. Consumers from a consumer protection standpoint, because you're a cooling utility, you can't have monopolistic rights. From a cooling utility, from an investment protection standpoint. So I think every stakeholder had issues, right? So that was the first realization that, at least for a company like us, we saw that, there has to be some kind of policy intervention because every single stakeholder has challenges and something needs to be done. Now, just because we think that doesn't mean the government needs to do something about it. Why do they need to care, right? And so on. But when it became quite clear that within the context of a country like UAE, right, where 70% of the peak energy demand is anyway for cooling, and you're already seeing this growing rapidly, and for whatever broad goals the country had back then in 2008-9, there's energy security, moving away from importing gas from places like Qatar, for example, and so on and so forth. It became quite clear that the specific stakeholder challenges kind of quite aligned well with some of the broader goals that the country itself had, and something had to be looked at to ensure that, that this should be looked at holistically. So that was the starting point, for example, in Abu Dhabi, to look at some kind of regulation. But in its implementation, because there, like I said, these siloed positions were not as rigid, and there was an ability to go top-down, in this case, if it's the PMO's office or whatever, to go top-down, to push through and see what barriers were there across the respective departments and ministries within the emirate, right? And then see, keeping the country goals and the respective stakeholder goals in mind, what can be done. It wasn't easy. Even though it was a very small place, it's just a city, right? It took 7 to 8 years. But through first us understanding the multiple stakeholder issues, seeing that it tied in very, very well with the country's requirements as well in general, or the Emirates requirements in general, then looking at ways and means to kind of cut across the various ministries and departments to implement something that addressed these challenges was the approach that kind of happened out there. Now apply that in the Indian context because of where we are at, and bringing back to cooling specifically. If we, anyway, the statistics that you mentioned of 4 trillion cooling degree days, and we anyway note 1/5 of our peak energy demand is already going for cooling. I don't know if you're aware, but the last 6 years, the peak power demand for cooling has exceeded the country's renewable energy capacity addition. So all the solar and wind is going only towards cooling. It's not going towards village electrification and so on. In some ways, basically, whatever wind and solar we're doing is only going towards cooling. And we know that this is a trend for the next 3 decades anyways, right? And if we have broader objectives of energy security and minimizing reliance on fossil fuels, climate, of course, another one, thermal comfort for all and so on, kind of ties in quite well. So that realization has to come from top to begin with. Once it comes from top and becomes something which is equally important to whether it's like a poverty alleviation and some of the other SDGs the country has, then it starts becoming a bit more clear that these kind of mission critical objectives for the country, so to say, need to be approached very differently and not at a bureau level and so on, and then accordingly I'm sure things will start to flow, right?
So before we open up, I just want to come back to you on this because Europe is seen as a leader in many of the climate initiatives. It has energy efficiency directive, which got turned into energy performance building directive. I'm not sure whether it has any cooling specific policy, or I think in the Nordic region and Scandinavian region. So Ravi, do you have like any specific example from where India can learn, just as I think Sudhir enumerated an example from UAE, and then we are going to open it for the audience. Yeah.
So, when I look at the journey that we have taken on cooling, I think we have done some remarkable work, both in terms of, the energy efficiency ever since we launched the PAT1 scheme, and also the ECBC and the star labeling program of the different applications. I think then later delivering the India Cooling Action Plan, which I don't think any country has done anywhere in the world. So I think we really need to compliment the leadership in BEE for the stellar job, because every country has unique problems, right? So if you ask me what is the template that I can bring to India from rest of the world, I think there are 2 or 3 things that come to my mind which we can do better than what we do today. First is demand planning, right? I mean, how do you plan the demand for the next 50 years, both in terms of energy and cooling, and how do you make sure that we have laser precision in executing them? On one end we plan, but also it requires huge amount of capital to execute. And planning alone, if you don't execute, then 5 years later you have a gap, right? Then you again try to replan, so that we are always in a catch-up mode on that. So what I have seen, many countries are able to break their original plans into micro plans and execute, right? So we need to look at how do we break some big plans we have. For example, we have a plan of 2070 decarbonization. And I can tell you many states don't even have yet looked into what does it take to decarbonize their states, right? We have this broad agenda of 2070. Only yesterday we were in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu has released a report on decarbonization by 2050 as a state, right? But how many states really have a pathways to get there, right? Because it's a humongous challenge. We are talking about grid decarbonization, we are talking about industrial decarbonization, we are talking about mobility decarbonization. Each of this requires huge amount of capital, right? Of course, we have the North Star defined, but how do you break this into micro targets? And how do you go about with laser precision execution? This is one gap which I see, which we need to improve upon. I think the second is the skill gap, right? I don't think still cooling is seen as a very attractive business proposition for young people to come in. I'm very happy that lots of millennials and Gen Zs are sitting in this room, but I'm very happy for that. But I think it is still not seen as a very exciting opportunity, right? How do you attract a lot more diversity of talent into this business, which I see is happening in many parts of the world, right? So skill is a very important piece for us to really change the dynamics of this industry. And with digital, I think it's even more easier to attract diversity. Because imagine the world is going to see 3 to 5% of the $100 trillion year on year for decarbonization. A lot of money is going to flow into it. In my view, 40 to 50% of it is going to come to cooling actually. And digital will be all more important for us to really look at bringing those dashboards and taking action either on scope 1, scope 2, circularity and all of that stuff. So I think skilling, creating more awareness among the young people, we as a country need to do a lot on cooling. We haven't done that. We need to do it in multi-scale, because we need, at least this is an industry which can create 10 million jobs in the next 5 years. There's a huge opportunity and huge amount of money that can be made in this industry. The last one is harmonization of the stakeholders. I think, when you make a policy, there are multiple actors in the policy. And I think we take a long time to sign on what we have agreed, right? Sometimes we agree in the room, go back and disagree that we can't do this actually. So I think this harmonization is one big challenge I see in India compared to many other, because you have multiple actors. And remember, if India wants to be using the current window that is available for us, we only have 7 years left to pivot and become, a rising economy. Because if you miss the 7 years, you miss the bus. Then it's probably Africa or some other continent actually. So aligning ourselves is one of the biggest challenges I see actually. Aligning of policy makers along with all the stakeholders, aligning of the national governments with the state government, aligning of ministries which you mentioned about it. This damn alignment is really where, because alignment brings trust. Alignment brings trust, trust brings speed and agility to the economy. We really miss this from a policy perspective in my view.
No, this is very well said, and I think it's coming through from both, I think, your and Sudhir's comments, that I think when it's a policy that is, or regulation that is being promulgated by a ministry, then it's Government of India rule. It is not like a ministry rule, which sometimes we see happen here, I think, and that actually holds us back. So I think your point very well made. I think we would like to receive some questions from the audience, and I'm looking, so I think here is a hand that is, please introduce yourself and be very brief and to the point, and if you want to direct the question to one person, then please do so.
Yes, I'm Anish Sharma. I'm working as a consultant with Forrester Research. My basic question is that why are we not able to see cooling as a solution, as a basically as an innovation that can move forward? Basically, we are seeing that same sort of story with the EV industry. Also, EVs are also fighting with the fossil fuel cars, for example, and the adoption is not taking place. Same is the case with the air conditioners, chillers, etc. versus district cooling. We are finding that air conditioning companies basically market themselves aggressively. They say that that the maintenance costs are low and you will have the control, etc. Same with the chillers, etc. But the district cooling basically is not able to take forward as you were saying, and the panelists were saying that Parliament House
Please,
basically had chillers, etc.
What is your question?
So my basic question is that why is it that this conflict between the old infrastructure legacy companies with the new innovations can take forward, with the digital technologies, etc. Because a lot of commercial establishments take it as a sort of as the expenditure, long-term expenditure, rather than as a take it from a sustainable point of view. Yeah.
I think it's the answer to that is very simple, but of course, while the answer is simple, doesn't mean that the implementation is easy. It's a lot to do with basically the inertia and the mindset towards, because people already are used to doing things in a certain way, and there are multiple stakeholders across the ecosystem that do a certain part of the work that needs to be done. Look at cooling, district cooling, for example. You need to shift from somebody, an architect, to an MEP consultant, to a contractor, to an operator, to a maintenance company, to one single company doing everything, right? So to cut across the entire value chain is not easy, because there are multiple people who are doing certain parts of the work. Plus, shifting from focus right now is CapEx is separate, OpEx is separate. Nobody takes a life cycle view of something. And district cooling, of course, is more capital intensive. So, but being able to look at it more holistically and taking a life cycle view, and then being okay from a life cycle standpoint to spend what needs to be spent, and then ensure that you get the benefit of that, is also not easy. And so that's where you see a lot of practical challenges on the ground from adoption, irrespective of policy and so on and so forth. Right? Was it clear?
Any other question? I see one hand in the back. Can someone give the gentleman?
Hi, good evening, sir. This is Satish Sherawat. I am from Johnson Control Hitachi. Actually, my question is not actually to the panelist, because I worked in a district cooling project in Middle East. So, as Sudhir sir rightly said, that government policies and new ideas has to be there to push that district cooling in India, especially. So when we worked in Dubai, especially for Mall of Emirates and this Mall of Arabia, so we have been pushed by DEWA, actually Dubai Electricity and Water Authority, that you cannot get at maximum 50% of your renewable water you need to consume within the building, and we 50% will supply. So such type of policy as defined by government hardly can lead to a better ideas actually. So the second idea was how can we save our cooling tower intake water quantity. So actually, I worked with the WSP for around 3.5 years, and by chance, I get a chance to work with the ETA. So who designed and developed that these two or three projects. So what we did is we accumulated all the condensate from entire building and dumped into the cooling towers. So with that areas, we reduced water level as well, and water consumption as well, as and IKW for chillers as well. So like these policies, I mean, we can, it can help to push that.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Satish, for
thank you.
those suggestions and ideas. Any comment? Yeah. Yeah.
You know, when Emirates Mall was thought about as a vision, you had 1.0, 2.0 and 3.0. The vision was very clear. Whereas if you look at the AeroCity project, the terminal was decided as 1.0, right? Terminal B was 1.1, right? AeroCity Hotel was 1.4, right? This is how we built our cities actually. So what happened finally, we missed the bus on district cooling. What is going to happen in Noida is not very different from what has happened already in the AeroCity. Noida is a great opportunity for district cooling, the Noida airport. Large airports, we have missed the bus again. Because we have this 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 incremental thinking in our design philosophy. We don't have the large design thinking philosophy what Emirates had when building the mall.
So is it a mindset issue? I think we can't think big and we can't think more futuristic.
I think it's combination of both, right? I mean, if you think long term, your cost of doing things comes down. If you think short term, you live for tomorrow but not for day after tomorrow.
Thank you.
And
I think
I'll just
there was
add
a
one point,
gentleman-
Satish. I mean, no, I think on the example
sorry.
that Ravi gave on the airports, I think it's not just mindset, but also in the airport specifically, regulation is a barrier, in fact. I won't go into the details, but I mean, the current regulatory construct of ERA kind of inhibit an airport owner from doing district cooling in terms of how aero tariffs are determined. So I'll just keep it at that. But so yeah, so that's where it didn't work for Noida's case.
Thanks, Sudhir. Yeah, I know that you must be looking at Jawari Airport closely and must be figuring out what's the issue. Okay. I think there was a gentleman. Yeah, I think please introduce yourself. Please ask your question shortly, and if you have an observation, keep it brief.
Yeah, good evening all. This is Prashant, and I am into solar-based cold room solutions company. My question is, we are facing a lot of challenges in terms of policies. There are like decade-old policies which are in place with respect to these cold rooms. This is the first question, like when are these going to change? And the second question is, there is no uniformity of policies in the entire nation. So like one state has certain subsidies and the other states have certain amount of subsidies. So this makes us to, like as an industry, we are suffering a lot, like we are having a lot of challenges. And even though customers are interested, like the clients are interested to get on these cold rooms, but we are like facing challenges to implement at a certain level.
Okay. So you want to? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Sometimes you should be happy that there are no policies,
Yeah,
you know.
we are just talking about it.
When you don't have policy, industry flourishes. When you have policy, industry sometimes slows down actually. But I don't think there's a ready-made policy solution for your case, because a solar cold room is a combination of cold room with solar energy, right? So there is a policy for a cold room and there is a policy for solar energy. There is no policy for combined solar cold room actually. But you can be innovative in the way you fund the project, if that gives you a good lead.
And also, I think since AEEE also works on cold chain, and so clearly, I think if you look at it, there is Ministry of sort of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare, and their schemes are more infrastructure focused. They are not taking into account energy efficiency and renewable energy. Sometimes renewable energy is being considered if you are looking for cold storage upgrades. So there are schemes like that. And I would suggest, I think there are some efforts that are being made in terms of integrating. If government is giving out some subsidies for pack house construction or especially for large projects, then energy efficiency needs to be brought in. So some standards and guidelines are being put in place. I think we are part of one or two initiatives there. So there is some work, and I know that I think Upendra in the last session has also, I think he asked you, because there is some financing construct that is also getting developed. So thank you. How much time do we, okay, please, yeah.
Thank you. I have been very intrigued by district cooling systems, and we talked to a lot of developers, and very recently had a conversation with a very large developer and asked him this particular question. So I have also posted this question on your LinkedIn post, Sudhir. The feedback that I got from them was that the cooling density of the system is low and doesn't particularly work in the Indian climatic condition. That was one. And second was that that it can only work for large luxury kind of enclaves. It doesn't really percolate down to a mass sort of a thing. So really wanted more clarity on this.
Yeah, I think, cooling density is important unless you have the right density. But I think what we've seen is in most cities in India, given the power tariffs that are there, whether it's residential or commercial, and the way buildings run, unless it's a very large villa compound, the density exists for it to be economically viable. And but I think the developer's feedback was mostly misplaced, I would say, in the sense it's either based on certain misconceptions or probably not having looked into it in a bit more detail, is what I can just kind of simply say. Yeah.
If I have to put out a poll option here, you can even use your hands now actually. Let's assume you are in an apartment, a multi-rise apartment, and if you have to pay 250 to 300 rupees extra for district cooling into your homes instead of putting air conditioners, how many of you would really go for district cooling? Very good. I think you all have to give a big applause for those who put their hands up. This is the mantra actually, like if in Mumbai, if your square feet is 20,000 rupees, district cooling is still for you at 300 rupees. If it is in Delhi, if your square feet is 12,000 rupees, district cooling is only for 300 rupees.
And I'll just add to that. So what I think Ravi is talking about is as a one-time upfront payment towards CapEx. And then for the rest of your life, for the next 30 years, you don't need to spend anything on buying ACs and so on and so forth. So that's, yeah.
So since there is no question, I have written down actually 3 questions. So just give me like 2 minutes more. I just want to see. So what is more important according to people in the audience? Is it refrigerant or is it energy efficiency? So refrigerant people, raise your hand. Wow, we have like an overwhelming. And energy efficiency? So clearly efficiency aficionados more here. What do you think is more important, policy or technology? So policy people, raise your hand. And technology? Okay, so policy wins here. Do you believe in centralized system or decentralized cooling system? So centralized cooling system and decentralized cooling system? Okay, all right, so that's it. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you for that very insightful session. I'm sure we all learned something. Now I would like to request Dr. Satish to please present the experts with a token of gratitude.